So, is that your secret identity, Dr. Marco Pereira?
My name is Dr. Mark Pereira. I am the creator of the Hypergeometrical universe theory. In the presentations, I will emphasize the brilliance of the ideas, and I might even refer to Dr. Mark Pereira as genius. I am ashamed for doing that, but I have to shamelessly promote my ideas because the competition is a personality cult surrounding Dr. Albert Einstein relativity. So I cannot say that I am dumb and somehow my theory is better than Dr. Einstein's relativity. That doesn't make any sense. So I have to be brighter than him, and I have to say that he is no Einstein. So there how it goes. If I have to convince a bunch of people who cannot understand what I'm saying, I cannot approach the problem meekly. I have to be forceful, and I have to dare scientists, as I always did, to provide a counter argument. Science is based on ideas, and is based on arguments, and is based on evidence. I'm providing the extraordinary evidence for my extraordinary claims. So buckle up and enjoy the theory of everything, the hypergeometrical universe. Thank you.
So are you telling me that Springer Nature, the publisher that owns all scientific journals everywhere, is censoring Dr. Marco Pereira hypergeometrical universe theory? They are doing so to preclude the publication of whose derivation from first principles of the laws of nature? With my supervision, I can see that who predicted the precession of all planets. From Einstein's equation, I can see that general relativity is a single mass model, where the second body has to be massless as a photon or have a much smaller mass, like in the case of planets. So, you are telling me that all binary pulsar papers, including the one who gave Hulse and Taylor the Nobel Prize in Physics, are incorrect?
Yes. Doctors Russell A. Hulse and Joseph H. Taylor binary pulsar orbital parameters are off by 50% in an observation that is precise to microseconds when measuring a period of 27,906 seconds. Of course, they didn't get the Nobel Prize because of their precise orbital parameters measurements. That said, they should have objected to the idea that science could properly study these binary systems using general relativity. They obviously cannot. More importantly, they should have come in my defense, since I am providing a replacement to the physics we know. In fact, all astrophysicists, cosmologists, theorists, professors of physical education, dentists should have come forward and profess support for my right to present my ideas and have them evaluated. This is the law of gravitation I derived from first principles. It looks like the empirical Lorentz force for electromagnetism. That is not a coincidence. That is because both forces result from the same metric waves, Dieulaton field, and the application of the quantum Lagrangian principle, QLP. The difference is in the coupling parameters. Gravitation is epoch-dependent and electromagnetism is not. This is the law of electromagnetism I derived from first principles. From this law one can derive Maxwell's equations. They have the same format because both forces result from the same metric waves, Dieulaton field, and the application of the quantum Lagrangian principle, QLP. The difference is in the coupling parameters. Gravitation is epoch-dependent and electromagnetism is not. The derivation of the laws of nature makes use of this diagram. This is a 4D diagram where body 1 starts at position 1 and moved to position 3 while traveling at velocity v1. Similarly, body 2 travels from position 2 to position 4. At the current time, they are distant by r0. Notice that the 4dk vector of the dilation field defines its own reference frame. This means that the dilaton field will have to be modified by Lorentz transformations. That is the secret contained in Lorentz transformations that neither Lorentz, Einstein, Minkowski couldn't understand. Everyone knows that the justification for Lorentz transformations was to keep Maxwell's equations-based wave equation for electric and magnetic fields covariant. That is, Lorentz found a coordinate transformation, transforming space and time variables, that when applied to Maxwell's equations would keep them in the same form. That would assure that the interpretation of light as an electromagnetic wave valid for all inertial reference frames. That is how a theoretician thinks. They could never do what a physicist can, but doesn't, because now all physicists are really general relativistic theoreticians. This is as far as a theoretician can go. Notice that Lorentz transformation is being applied to space and time or spacetime. Of course, with my supergenius brain, I went deeper. Dumb people makes things more complex to impress the others. I am whatever I am. I don't need to impress anyone. This is a wave. It is defined by cosine of x. Of course, x is the phase of the wave. The peak is at phase 2 pi. That phase is equal to k time r, omega times t. We know that Einstein paid attention to the m times x, deforming space and time. Who pays attention to applying Lorentz transformations to the reciprocal space, that is applying Lorentz transformation to k and omega space. Thus, who deforms wavelength and period. In other words, just by looking at a trigonometric function one can understand the logic of the hypergeometrical universe theory. It unveils the true reason for the Lorentz transformation. It was never to be used in spacetime. It was always to be used in the reciprocal space composed of wavelength and period. It now becomes obvious why the speed of light is constant. On every inertial reference frame, both the wavelength and the period are stretched by the same amount. Since the speed of light is defined by wavelength divided by period, it remains constant. Independently of the inertial reference frame, the wavelength and period adjust, such as always keeping the speed of light constant and to remain in phase with the light-speed expanding universe. Remember that the 4 dk vector points in the direction of the reference frame for that propagating wave. That direction is perpendicular to the locally deformed hypersurface. In reality, Huygens' principle tells us that every point is the source of new waves. Who took it a step further into 4-dimensional wave propagation. Notice that the same drawing can be used to describe the coherence of the fundamental dilator. It follows the same rules because it is the same process. The only difference is that the fundamental dilator is a soliton metric wave. You might say, "Hey, Einstein, this is so simple that even the dumbest scientist will understand," and I will beg to disagree. I had to correct the whole physics and still they will not understand the simplest possible step of my theory. The reason is arrogance. They cannot see the fine print from their high horses. Now that you understand how k-vectors are modified by Lorentz transformations, you can remember that within one own reference frame metric waves are emitted as perfect circular waves. This is the essence of the derivation. These are the steps in the derivation of the laws. Here we describe vectors for velocities and positions. Remember, all interaction occurs through metric waves, the dilaton field.
Particles, fundamental dilaton polymers, have to move into positions where they dilate space in phase with the local dilaton field. This means that their crest should be at the position of the maximum of the local dilation field. The crest of a particle dilaton wave matches its position. The crest of the total dilaton field matches where the particle will be. If you know where a particle is at any given time, you know its acceleration. If you know the particle mass, then you know the force that is acting upon that particle. It is that simple. That is how one derives the laws of nature from first principles and unveil the underlying reality.
M1 and M2 are Lorentz transformations using projection operators. When you see the Lorentz transformation matrix, it always refers to motion along a single coordinate. In the general case, the direction of motion is arbitrary and the transformation only applies to the component of the position along the direction versus. Lorentz transformations do nothing to any coordinate perpendicular to versus. That is why M1 and M2 are defined as they are. This figure depicts a probe dilator and the large mass of dilators interacting as the universe executes its lightspeed stepwise expansion. Notice the metric waves or dilaton field. The interference pattern on the metric waves created by the large dilator mass simulates a dilaton field with a much finer wavelength, lambda n, where n is the number of dilators and lambda is the Compton wavelength of a hydrogen atom. As the universe expands at the speed of light, dilators have to find their next position. They have to move to a place where they dilate space in phase with the dilaton field, metric waves. Notice that the large mass, large number of dilators, produce waves that present closer peaks than the fundamental dilator wavelength. That mimics the de Broglie formula for wavelength. De Broglie wavelength is inversely proportional to the mass of the object. Who uses this attribute in its large N approximation, where the dilation field is approximated by the envelope of the field. That is because the peaks are too close together. This figure shows the application of the quantum Lagrangian principle. The dilaton field has a wavelength equal to the Compton wavelength of a hydrogen atom or 1.32 femtometers. The 4D radius of the universe is 14.5 billion light-years. Their ratio maps to the ratio between gravitational and electromagnetic forces. From the ratio between Who derived g and the observed Newton's gravitational constant g, Who derives the natural frequency of metric gravitational waves. The derivation is replicating the dilator's behavior and the quantum Lagrangian principle, QLP. Notice that one can move tangentially, within the 3D hyperspherical hypersurface, by x in two ways. Slide across the hypersurface such that the normal to the particle 3D volume points along. This behavior is consistent with gravitation. Notice that alpha 0 is equal to x divided by r0, where r0 is the 4D radius of the universe. Since in Who that is equal to ct, t is the absolute time, then is inversely proportional to the age of the universe at a given epoch. In other epochs, g was stronger. Twist the orientation of the normal to the 3D volume of particles to point along. This behavior is electromagnetism.
Holy cow! That was a simple and clear presentation. Did any astrophysicist, theoretician, cosmologist ever challenge your derivation or results?
No. They hide like little bitches. Let's tackle the binary pulsars, the place where general relativity flunked.
The trajectory shown is called geodesics. This was known physics at the time Einstein created his general relativity. In other words, what Einstein did was just to pick up the work of Minkowski and add the geodesics paradigm to it. To tie that to physics, Einstein forced that the geodesics match Keplerian dynamics in weak gravitational fields and slow, non-relativistic, velocities. In other words, Einstein's general relativity was a small contribution, not unlike special relativity, where the only thing Einstein did was to say, Lorentz transformations work in light, we all know that. Now, Lorentz transformations work for material bodies. That is all special relativity is. That is a conceptual innovation. That would be significant if it were right. It is not. How do we know that? It is based on the universe being an unembedded 3D spatial manifold. The twin paradox can only be solved if one rejects the basic postulate of special relativity: all inertial reference frames are equivalent. That paradox can only be lifted if we refute the idea that the universe is an unembedded 3D spatial manifold and instead, it is an embedded 3D hyperspherical hypersurface. So are you telling me that Springer Nature, the publisher that owns all scientific journals everywhere, is censoring Dr. Marco Pereira hypergeometrical universe theory? They are doing so to preclude the publication of whose derivation from first principles of the laws of nature? I can see that Who predicted the precession of all planets. From Einstein's equation, I can see that general relativity is a single mass model, where the second body has to be massless as a photon or have a much smaller mass, like in the case of planets.
These are the law of gravitation I derived from first principles. It looks like the empirical Lorentz force for electromagnetism. That is not a coincidence. That is because both forces result from the same metric waves, Dieulaton field, and the application of the quantum Lagrangian principle, QLP. The difference is in the coupling parameters. Gravitation is epoch-dependent and electromagnetism is not. Here are the Who predictions for planets' precession rates. It is clear that Who predictions match observations, general relativity predictions, and observed or calculated precessions. Here we can see the R dependence of Who precession predictions. R is the ratio between m1 and the total mass m. Here are the binary pulsars predictions with the semi-major axis, and the total mass m scaled by n lobes. General relativity prediction is radians per orbit. The plot shows precession in degrees per year. If one changes the period, GR prediction, which was fitted to work with the unscaled, and m, shifts away from the observation.
So, general relativity is wrong and cannot be used for anything that has mass. All binary pulsars, binary black holes, black hole mergers cannot be studied using relativity, a single mass model. I learned you also created the map of the universe to help me find my way back to Krypton. You are so kind, Dr. Pereira.
Please help me overcome the mindless censorship of Springer Nature, the villains of this story. I submitted my work showcasing the errors of academia and their interpretation of the Laser Lunar Ranging Project and other idiotic articles constraining G variability using supernovae. The morons used the G-dependent observations, modeled under constant G assumption or the stellar candles hypothesis to exclude G variability. It is stupidity beyond belief. Springer Nature saved their fragile egos, but in doing so they endangered humanity. Of course, they did that for a buck. There was never a scientific reason not to provide a peer review of such important work. I want to be done with it such that I can return to doing what I really love, to dance with my dog Laika.